Good afternoon. So it's a little bit later than I had originally wanted to get this video done and up to you for the introduction to British Romanticism. I have it's approximately 2:50 on the 11th of January 2020. That just gives you a real sense of where I am in the process and that I am actually making this for you. So the goal here is to have your notes out. I'm allowing you now to rewind the video to cover notes in case you've missed those. So you want to make sure that you've gotten that material together. So what you're going to see, especially if you're new to this process, is I'm going to be cutting from video like this to PowerPoint slides. I'm going to supply notes. I'm going to do a variety of things. At the end, you're going to have an opportunity to show me that you have gleaned the notes and you've done the things that you need to do. I figured that since we're, I don't know, at the end of the first week of school, I'm going to do this much more casually than I would do otherwise. So what you see is my new recording studio. So hopefully you're observing the things behind me in case that shows up as a question at the end or in class to make sure that you did the project. So this is the intro. I'm going to be cutting to some slides, so make sure you have your notes ready to go. The reason why Romanticism was so interesting, given that first set of slides and those couple of graphics, is the idea that it challenged the concepts and the really strong beliefs of the Enlightenment. So I'm going to turn to my left here. The watchmaker analogy, where God is this divine watchmaker where he simply creates something and then lets it run by itself. The watchmaker analogy, or the watchmaker argument, and here's where it gets fun, is a teleological, T-E-L-E-O, logical, T-E-L-E-O, logical argument, which states that design implies a designer. That if the world exists the way it does, then there must be someone or something behind why all of it is the way that it is. So the Enlightenment had to come up with a way to explain the world and the way the world existed. What the Romantics did, however, is they came up with a much more open-ended way to explain the world. So I think this is an interesting starting point for us to talk about in regards to all of this. So again, the teleological or physico-theological argument, just a little bit technical. Physico-theological argument, also known as the argument for intelligent design, is an argument for the existence of God, or more generally, for an intelligent creator based on perceived evidence of deliberate design in the natural world. That there must be a God, a somewhat benevolent God, in order for all of these things to work. The Enlightenment then said that science will discover all of these principles and that there are no such things as miracles, visions, or any kind of revelation. That there's no such thing as miracles, visions, or any kind of revelation. We're going to find that the Romantics absolutely challenge this idea when it comes to what their poetry tends to be about. So the next slide is going to give you an opportunity to do a side-by-side comparison of how you might write that in your notes. So here officially is your flipped lesson, an introduction to British Romanticism. You have my credentials in that nice hexagon in the right-hand corner. This is so that we can return to this anytime that we might need it in the future, and it creates a record for us. So again, introduction to British Romanticism. So what you see here, of course, is a basic definition of how this term romantic has come to basically mean a couple of different things. The first one, Absolutely. This is what our modern world and our secular life tells us all about what this term means. So, the loving or potentially loving relationships between men and women. It's amazing how much poetry is actually generated from that one central concept, the potentially loving relationships between men and women. Roses are red, violets are blue. Your eyes are so beautiful, and so are you. I know, terrible poetry made up on the fly, but it is exactly the level of what our culture would expect us to be able to do. The second definition, however, I think is a bit more specific, a way of looking at the world that looks beyond or ignores the world as it is and perceives a visionary one. A way of looking at the world that perceives a visionary possibility. I think if you're going to copy notes, this is something I want you to have that's much more specific and I think much more in tune with what we're trying to do with the course material. Now, of course, the word romantic originally referred to medieval tales of knights written in the original language of Latin. Basic elements we see here are love stories between a knight and his lady, resulting in the modern meaning of romance. Probably every, 3, 4 years, we get Hollywood producing another chivalric tale. So this actually harkens back to what we did with Beowulf and the Canterbury Tales. It's even hinted at in the things that we did in Macbeth. If you look, if you look at that last element there, when talking about the Romantic era in literature, we are actually referring to romantic as freely imaginative fiction and not romantic as in romantic love. So again, this gives you, I think, something very good for the sake of context. Now, let's go to that slide that I just jumped back from. So the origins of Romanticism take root as a movement following the French Revolution. We have hinted at, and we did this with the Canterbury Tales, that much of what begins British literature is French in origin. So these ideas of liberty and freedom, disenfranchisement, I had to think about that one for a second, which is why we had the pause, all starts from the French Revolution. So a huge, huge change in the way that we look at things. We also know that Romanticism proper begins with the publication of the lyrical ballads by Wordsworth and Coleridge in 1792. So this is where poetry explodes and we define this concept of literary romanticism. So these are the origins that I want you to be aware of as we track the reason why Romanticism was so interesting, given that first set of slides and those couple of graphics, is the idea that it challenged the concepts and the really strong beliefs of the Enlightenment. So I'm going to turn to my left here. The watchmaker analogy, where God is this divine watchmaker where he simply creates something and then lets it run by itself. The watchmaker analogy, or the watchmaker argument, and here's where it gets fun, is a teleological, T-E-L-E-O, logical, T-E-L-E-O, logical argument, which states that a design implies a designer. That if the world exists the way it does, then there must be someone or something behind why all of it is the way that it is. So the Enlightenment had to come up with a way to explain the world and the way the world existed. What the Romantics did, however, is they came up with a much more open-ended way to explain the world. So I think this is an interesting starting point for us to talk about in regards to all of this. So again, the teleological or physico-theological argument, just a little bit technical. physico-theological argument, also known as the argument for intelligent design, is an argument for the existence of God, or more generally, for an intelligent creator based on perceived evidence of deliberate design in the natural world. That there must be a God, a somewhat benevolent God, in order for all of these things to work. The Enlightenment then said that science will discover all of these principles and that there are no such things as miracles, visions, or any kind of revelation. That there's no such thing as miracles, visions, or any kind of revelation. We're going to find that the Romantics absolutely challenge this idea when it comes to what their poetry tends to be about. So the next slide is going to give you an opportunity to do a side-by-side comparison of how you might write that in your notes. So one of the particulars that we have an opportunity to do a side-by-side comparison of here is this idea of reason versus emotion. And I know it says Romantic era, but I believe that the Age of Reason is the logic and the Romantic era is the emotion piece that we see in direct sort of conflict with each other. So the Age of Reason is this idea of reason and judgment, the value of society as the whole, while Romanticism puts all of that emphasis on imagination and the value of the individual human being, especially as seen through the value of freedom and what they can do on their own. This presumes that human beings are inherently good in this romantic vision of what all of this means. So I think, again, this is going to give us a really good idea of how these particulars work for us to compare as we go along. So while we are aware of these side-by-side comparisons of the Age of Reason with this new burgeoning era of Romanticism, here we have a slide that represents exactly what that clash was. The French Revolution is really the catalyst that brings about all of this change that gets us to the Romantic period. History classes study the French Revolution, all of that. I'm concerned about it because it creates a model for the world that would lead to the liberation of the human spirit. To the liberation of the human spirit. So now we have a break from the logic, and we have a huge opportunity to go through and to do some very specific study of why these changes occur. And what I do is I break it down sort of into 5 major themes here. As you can see on the left, it's called characterized by the 5 I's. Imagination, intuition, idealism, inspiration, and individuality, and the role that each of these is going to play in the development of this new intellectual potential that exists in the history and the literature of the day. Of course, we can tie this to art, we can tie this all to political theory and those kinds of things. I'm going to focus on taking these 5 I's and I'm going to convert them, sort of define them as they would apply to the development of literature. As we take a look at these 5 I's, the first one is imagination. So when we talk about imagination, to the Romantics, it's far more significant, far more important than that of reason. We've really stepped away from this need for empirical numbers and concrete black and white data to be able to explain what's going on. So we know that there was a backlash against rationalism characterized by the neoclassical period of the Age of Reason. That's exactly what I talked about at the beginning of this. So there was a backlash against these ideas of the neoclassic period. So I find that to be significant. We know that imagination was considered necessary for the creation of all art, visual auditory, all those kinds of things, but in particular to the development of poetry and everything that it came to mean. We know that Samuel Taylor Coleridge called this changing period the intellectual intuition. He called this shift from reason over to this emotional idea. He called it the intellectual intuition, to see the world through very different eyes. So I find that to be significant as a way for us to look at the development of imagination. Now, as you can see, I'm reading from the notes that I have on my iPad that I put together for all of this. So that first characteristic, again, just to recap it, that Coleridge calls the intellectual institution is the ability to see beyond what is concrete and finite in front of us. That second characteristic, or intuition, as we see it in the earlier slide, is fairly significant. The Romantics placed value on intuition, or feeling and instincts, and how they used those to perceive the world around them. And they valued that over the fact that facts were important, or they valued it over the idea of intuition. So I think, again, very specifically, Romantics placed value on intuition and saw it much more highly than that of reason. So for what we're going to be talking about, emotions are very important in the study of Romanticism. Another major sort of thing that you wrote down, like Coleridge said about Romanticism a little bit earlier, I was going to say a little bit ago, but a little bit earlier, is the idea that Wordsworth calls poetry the spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions. Again, Wordsworth calls poetry the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. This is that sensuous nuance that I referred to earlier. Our ability to understand how these ideas function is very much this sensuous nuance, this powerful overflow of important emotions. Again, I'm rephrasing it a little bit, but it gives you something to focus on. So at this phase, you should have a slide, or you should have notes on imagination. You should have notes on intuition and how it really contributes to the development of British Romanticism. I look at it this way. I'll give you a poem, and I bet I'm going to use these 5 characteristics as a way to evaluate your ability to do the analysis. The third characteristic is that of idealism. Idealism is the concept that we can make the world a better place. Or a better translation of that is that the poet can somehow transform the reader into seeing the world as filled with unlimited potential. That the poet can convince the reader of the sensuous nuance that exists out there in the world. Now, give me a second to read this. Idealism refers to any theory that emphasizes the spirit, the mind, or language over matter. Thought has a crucial role in making the world the way it is. Thought has a crucial role in making the world as it is. So, what an interesting way to look at it. We shape how we perceive the world around us by the attitudes and the idealistic beliefs that we bring. This is why Romanticism is inherently positive. Immanuel Kant. Love this. Kant, K-A-N-T. Immanuel, I-M-M-A-N-U-E-L. Kant is a German philosopher, and he held that the mind forces the world we perceive to take the shape of space and time. How we see the world helps us to shape the world. When I used to coach debate here at U of D, probably now 15 years ago, I spent a lot of time talking about Immanuel Kant and his approach to the way the world works. I'm going to define it again for you just to make sure that we're on the same page. Kant, a German philosopher, held that the mind forces the world we perceive to take the shape of space and time. Now, the last two elements I have here are inspiration, where the romantic artist, musician, or writer is an inspired creator rather than a technical master. So the inspired creator gives us ideas, may not completely flesh out what he means or she means, and the romantic writer leaves the reader to fill in the gaps, which I absolutely love as an idea. And this is why I can say that this unit gives us the opportunity to be right if we can prove our own perceptions. Inspiration also says that this is going to be a spontaneous moment, or being spontaneous is more important than being precise. Again, we've got to capture our sensuous nuance. We've got to be able to sort of connect with the world around us to feel what is going on and then to develop our perceptions from there. So I think this idea of inspiration is incredibly important. Lastly, in my list of characteristics here is individuality. A lot of the literature and the way that movements change over time can be evaluated based upon who does it apply to. Is it poetry that appeals to and explains the group experience, or is it individual and explains the human and how he or she sees the world? Romanticism is highly individualistic. So the Romantics celebrated the individual. During this period, women's rights and abolitionism were taking root as major movements, both in England and in the United States. We know that Walt Whitman, an American romantic, would write a poem entitled Song of Myself that begins, I celebrate myself. This also sounds a whole lot like what was going on with Emerson and Thoreau, as you guys covered that in American Transcendentalism. So these concepts, I think, are extraordinarily important. So if you need to go back and review this particular portion so that you have all of this in your notes, I'm going to give you that opportunity. I have one more section of this before I start to produce it and put the finishing touches, and that's going to be on the characteristics of the Romantic period. So if you take a look at this slide, I'm going to list them all for you, but then we're going to go through and we're going to define what we're going to do with each one. Final piece of this introduction to British Romanticism lesson. I've broken this down into some specific points that you want to use as themes for when you're reading individual poems or when you're doing any of your writing. I would expect that you would see these specifically in your notes at some point. So here's number one, that British Romantic poetry is about the common man and childhood and emphasizes that over urban sophistication. With sophomores in American Lit, I say that this is the value of childhood over educated sophistication. So either way, common man and childhood over urban sophistication becomes a significant theme. And as it says there, the Romantics believed in natural goodness, which is hindered by urban life or civilization, because it's when it's in the city, it's when it's around culture and the restraints of what that means that the individual suffers as a result of his own flaws, etc., etc. They believe that the savage is noble, childhood is good, and emotions inspired by both beliefs causes the heart to soar. So if I'm a note taker, I'm going to emphasize the last portion of that point number one. I talk about the emotions over reason. Again, that's that conflict of logic versus emotion. And here the Romantics believe that knowledge is gained through intuition rather than deduction. Seems self-explanatory. And of course, that spontaneous overflow of emotion that Wordsworth talks about, that we can relate to the sensuous nuance laid out in the lyrical ballads. These are all really important overall ideas. Now, we look at the last three. We value nature over the artificial. That's the wilderness versus the urban setting and urban environment. Romantics stress the awe of nature in art and language and the experience of the sublime through a connection with nature. Absolutely specific, totally rejecting the ideas of the Enlightenment and how that period affected the development of British Romanticism. For the individual over society, again, self-explanatory. And again, number 5, that concept of logic being inferior to the power of the imagination and the power of emotion absolutely seems to make sense to me as I look at the development of these particulars. Now, these 5 characteristics are going to show up over and over again in my notes and in the way we look at some of the major poems we're covering in this particular portion. So I think these 5 traits in particular are extraordinarily important. So you've got the common man in childhood over urban sophistication. I called it educated sophistication earlier. So often children are more intuitive than are the adults who rely too heavily on what they've been taught to believe. The idea that emotion is more important than reason, that nature is better than urban environments and the artificial situations we create. The individual is far better than the group. I could even tie this back into the ideas of Maslow, and that imagination is far superior to logic. Simple, straightforward ideas. So this brings us to the end of this first video presentation. Now I'm going to be using a lot of these over the course of this unit and this semester for the research paper for Romanticism in general. This is an excellent way for me to present notes and to be able to do this without absorbing class time when we're spending our time during discussion, like we did this past week with Carpe Diem poetry, the metaphysical. So I really think this is going to lead to a lot of content that we're going to get a chance to cover. After today, I think I'm going to be much less casual, since this is now moving into that official second week of school. But your job is to make sure that you review the notes, make sure that you take the notes, and come in prepared. Probably going to give you a quiz on Monday to make sure that you have these particulars. So if you made it all the way through the presentation, finish the quiz, and that will tell me that you have completed the homework on time. Then come in on Monday prepared with this content so that you can again show me that you've done the work. So with that, have a great rest of your day. And if there's anything you need, make sure you email me.